I'm Esther Gillies, President of the California Social Welfare Archives. Today we are at the Galen Center on the campus of the University of Southern California, where I will be talking with Margaret Orrantia about her lifelong work with the Native American populations in both California and New Mexico. Ms. Orrantia earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in English and Master of Science degree in Counselor Education from San Diego State University. Her work history includes a wide variety of positions addressing the needs of Native Americans, as well as advocacy activities designed to improve the lives of Indian children in the child welfare system. Margaret, thank you so much for being with us today. To begin with, can you tell us what drew you to your work with the Native American population in California and New Mexico? How did you get involved?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, I never started out to be a social worker. I didn't know what I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to travel, so I took opportunities to do that. One of the first jobs I had was working at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And while I was there, I had a number of positions, but I started out working in the dormitories. It was a boarding school, and young people came there from all over the country with an interest in becoming artists. So I worked in the dormitory, and you know, I really enjoyed working with those young people. I wasn't very much older than they were, and they were always really surprised when I knew what they were up to. And I was always 2 steps ahead of them, and they could never figure it out. And one of them asked me one day, and I said, well, it's what I would be doing. So that's really where it began. I was there for almost 20 years. I really enjoyed working with the young people. When I moved back to San Diego, California, I already had that 20 years of doing a lot of administrative work at the Institute, and then the work that I did with the young people, for all intents and purposes, the majority of those young people were foster children, because it was a boarding school, and many of the young people that came there had no place else to go. They were all called them wards of the court then, and if they weren't at the school, then they had no place to live. So, you know, I pretty much started doing social work. I was a counselor, but I pretty much started doing social work then. So I really enjoyed doing it. And
were all of the students Native American?
All of them.
Okay.
You had to be at least 1/4 Indian in order to go to the school, and it was a school run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So yes, we had. When I first started working there, it was a 4-year high school, and then 2 years of what they call postgraduate work. Over time, they began to do away with the high school. So, one year they stopped bringing in freshmen. The next, they stopped bringing in sophomores, and it continued like that until it was just the 2-year postgrad school. So, I worked with a lot of the youth and tried to find, for the kids that we couldn't find some place for them to go in, you know, in the summer when they left school, I would just bring them home with me and turn my house into a kind of a mini dormitory until school started again. So I became a foster mom at that time. Working in the boarding school was like being a foster parent. So that was my first venture into doing what I would call, you know, social work. When I came back to California, I came back with, you know, all that experience of having worked with young people, with their families, of having had a number of positions at the Institute that allowed me to really get some really good skills in administration, and also really good skills on how to maneuver my way through large bureaucracies. Because most large bureaucracies like the status quo. They don't like people who rock the boat. And so I taught myself how to rock the boat without them knowing it was rocking. And so therefore I got to do a lot of things. I learned how to do a lot of things that when I came to California stood me in good stead. So when I came back to California, I went to work at it was called the Indian Child Welfare Consortium at the time. And the consortium was a consortium of 14 tribes from San Diego and Riverside counties. And then we also took on 3 urban programs that were in San Diego County. The tribes had to join us by resolution, and then that gave us the authority and the ability to go into court to represent them and to represent children from their tribes. So.
Was this exclusively about children, or was it for other issues too?
No, it was strictly to work with children that were in the child welfare system in San Diego and Riverside counties.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And this was about what time frame?
Beginning in 1984.
Okay.
So the time frame would look like this. The Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted on November 8th, 1978. The Congress did not appropriate any funds until 1980. So in 1980, there were 2 reservations in San Diego County, La Jolla and Palma, who put their little bit of money together, and they formed what became known as the consortium. And the first year, what they did was they did an assessment for the needs of the tribes in San Diego. What do they need? And so they did that for a couple of years. And in 1982, they actually, were funded to provide social services to the tribes in that area. So I came about 2 years later, which was in 1984.
And was the assessment directed also at children's needs?
Children's needs and the family's needs and the needs of the tribe. So so that they knew, more or less what kind of a program they needed to design and develop. So yeah, so that's how it began. Two forward-thinking tribes. I always admire that they had the instinct to do that. I always thought that was pretty brilliant.
So then you were there pretty much at the beginning.
At the beginning.
And what did you encounter and what did you experience as you got involved in that position?
Well, when I was first hired, I was hired to run a small grant that they had with the state. And it was really interesting because whoever wrote the grant didn't know anything about implementing program. So the grant itself was really a challenge because it had goals and objectives that were unattainable. So I had to try and figure out how to make some kind of an impact, knowing full good and well that what was written was going to be a real challenge for everybody, for them, for us. But somehow, we managed to work something out that provided services to the population that it was supposed to be providing to, and to satisfy the state that we were doing something that was useful and beneficial. So that's where I started. I had been there just a little bit of time, maybe 2 or 3 months, and the woman who was the director invited me to lunch one afternoon and told me that she was going to resign. It was a lot of work. It was hard work. And she said, I don't want to do this anymore. She said, she says, I'm resigning. She says, I've already talked to the board, and I've asked them to put you in as the interim director. And I thought, oh my gosh. But, I said, sure. I said, I'll interim, no problem, I can do that. They'll hire another director, and I'll keep managing my little program over here. What happened was, no, I did not apply for the position, but the staff that were working at the consortium actually wrote my resume and submitted it to the board, and then they told me to show up in the evening. They told me the day and the time to show up for the interviews. And so I showed up and I did the interview, and they hired me. So the part of it that they did not hear in my comments today was that they hired me this week and then they were going to fire me next week. Because not because of me or anything I had or had not done, but the board was having its own turmoil, and you know how boards are. They were having their own problems, their own turmoil. And so, I told them, you hired me and you can fire me. I said, but you haven't given me a chance to show you what I know how to do. I said, but it's your call, not mine. So they relented, and they said, well, go ahead and stay.
And you were there for how long then?
For about 8 years, I think. So,
And what were you able to accomplish during that time?
Well, they didn't tell me everything when they hired me, so I found some things out after I had started doing the work. For example, I didn't know that the consortium had been closed down because they hadn't paid their payroll taxes. So they were, a couple of years behind in paying off their payroll taxes. Somehow the board convinced the IRS to let them open up again and continue. So for the first year that I was there, or maybe 18 months, my job was to go around to everybody that had, to the landlord whose facility we were renting, all the people who had, sold things to the consortium and hadn't been paid, was to go around and apologize and then to promise that we would make everything good. So that was what I did for about the first year or 18 months. So that wasn't too pleasant. And then the rest of it was my just learning, how the consortium worked. How I'd never worked for a board, so that was something new that I had never done. So I had to learn how to manage that. And also we were having problems with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who was our funding agent. And that whole thing was a disaster, because the Bureau was on a reimbursement schedule, and most of the time when we sent in our reimbursement forms, something would happen to them, they'd get lost, or something would happen, and we wouldn't get our reimbursements on time. So that meant, we couldn't pay our staff, we couldn't pay our bills, it was just not working. So I knew how to do some things, and so I began to exert some pressure and let them know that they needed to change the way they did the funding. And I did.
This was the Bureau.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I did talk a little bit about that in the comments, that basically I asked for congressional investigations of the Sacramento office, because I knew that meant a lot of, for them, was going to be a lot of problems. They were going to have to answer. I saw the paperwork that they had to fill out. It was a lot of paperwork. And I knew that somebody would be coming to check out their operations, and I knew that the Bureau wouldn't be happy. But I knew that if I did that they would listen. And so that's how it worked out.
But that suggests that you had, over the years, done your homework and you understood the bureaucratic structure.
Yes.
Which allowed you then to take advantage of that knowledge to understand the pressure points.
Yes.
Where you would get a response.
Yes. Yes. I thoroughly trained myself when I was working at the Institute in Santa Fe. The policies, the rules, the regulations, how you did things, how you could get around things. I thoroughly learned how to do that. Yes.
Now what you describe is a situation that is, if I can use the word, dysfunctional at multiple levels, not operating, and yet there you were, and you stayed.
I stayed.
What was the driving force that made you convinced that you wanted to make it work?
Oh, there were many driving forces. First of all, the fact that this staff that I hadn't known for very long had the kind of faith in me to, against my own wishes, go ahead and submit a resume and make an appointment for me to go be interviewed by the board. I mean, there aren't too many people who would do that. So that was the first thing. The second thing was I had already started working with some of these families, and I had already seen some of the children. And I mean, how could I not? How could I not? I saw some of the things that were already going on with the county, with the lack of cooperation. I had already seen some of the things that were going on in the courts.
And what were those things?
Well, with the county, basically they treated my staff with just a complete and total lack of respect, which was, to me, that wasn't going to last. We were going to change that. We were expected to go into court and make recommendations on behalf of the children and on behalf of the families, and yet they would not share any documents with us. So we didn't know why children were detained. A lot of the time we didn't know where they were detained. And we didn't know what allegations had been made against the parents. We didn't know what the treatment plans were. We didn't know anything. And yet we were supposed to come into court and make recommendations. So without having any kind of knowledge about what had happened, any recommendation we made was going to be ridiculous because it would be uninformed. So yeah, that wasn't going to stay that way for me. When we went into the courts, again, there was a law that said to the state court, this is the remedial law. There are things that you do when you work with Indian children and families that are wrong. So this law is going to fix that. Well, apparently nobody read it because they wanted to do business as usual. We would come into court. Most of the times they would not recognize us. If they did, we did not have a name. They would just lump us all together and say, here come the Indians, which was, you know, degrading. And that wasn't going to stay either. That was going to change. So over time, we got a man into the court, the juvenile dependency court. His name was Napoleon Jones. And he was an African-American man. He was a really, truly wonderful man. He was compassionate and he was kind. And immediately he saw what was going on. And very quickly, everything changed. He started making rulings in court. You know, the first ruling was that we were to be given all the documents having to do with any of the children in our caseload. That was the first thing he said. The second thing he did was he would not hold a hearing if there was not a representative from our agency there. So if there was not a tribal representative, the hearing would be continued. Well, the county doesn't like that because, you know, if the social workers are ready to come to court and then they continue it, that's a wasted large part of their day, a large part of their day. So of course they didn't like that. And so he started making rulings in our favor.
Now, how did that happen? Was your organization influential in educating him or helping him understand that these problems existed in the court?
Well, we talked with him and, you know, told him about the act. We said, and the act requires, you know, these certain things when we come to court. I said, but your predecessors have completely ignored it. And he was just a good man. What else can I say? Because, you know, there's still courts today where we have that same exact issue, where there's not that willingness to comply with the act throughout not only in this state, but throughout the country. We see that all the time. But he made sure that changed. And having changed it, it never went back to how it was. When he left, those who came after him, there was a precedent set already about how you behave. And so it continued. It continued.
So what I am concluding from what you're saying is that even though the position as presented needed a great deal of change and organizational structure and effectiveness, you really were tied to the cause, which
yes.
was much greater than the organization. But the organization could be made into a platform for creating the change you needed to make. And so you stayed with the agency.
I stayed with the agency, absolutely. So we just started, you know, tackling each of the problems. We, you know, the thing with the courts got somewhat resolved. Mm-hmm. So when we came into court, we had standing. Mm-hmm. We always had a representative. They listened to and worked on our recommendations that we submitted. And oftentimes our recommendations were counter to what was presented by the county social work staff. And they would take our recommendations because they knew that we knew the families, and they knew that we were representing our children, and we were doing what was in the best interest of our children. So they would listen to us. Mm-hmm. So that was a good thing. The thing with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you know, I knew that they could change the way that they funded us on an advance basis, where we spent the money and then just told them what we did with it. So. Yeah, after about the second or third congressional investigation, they called me into their office in Sacramento. They had a new overseer for the ICWA programs, and he and I had worked together in Santa Fe. He had worked in one of the dorms and I had worked in the other. And we had worked together for 2 or 3 years, so we knew each other pretty well. So it was really nice to see one another again, maybe not in those circumstances. But he called me into his office and he says, well, what do you want, Margaret? And I said, well, I want you to change us from, a reimbursement schedule to, I want you to start giving us quarterly advances. And he says, we can't do that. I said, you can. I says, I know you can do it. I says, I know why you don't do it, but I says, you can do it. And so he said, well, okay, he says, I'll do it on one condition. And I said, well, what's your condition? He said, don't tell the other programs we're doing this for you. And I said, no, I said, I can't promise you that. I said, but you will put us on that schedule anyway because I'll keep calling down in congressional investigations. And I said, I don't want to do it, and I know you don't want it to happen, but if that's the only weapon I have, I'll use it. And so he said, no, he says, you're on quarterly advances now. Before I left the office, he told me that. He says, you're on a quarterly advance now. I said, good. And I left. I went back to my office in San Diego from Sacramento. And the first thing I did when I walked in is I picked up the phone. I called all the other directors and told them, okay, we're on a quarterly advance basis now. Call over there and tell them that you want to be on the same schedule. Because what you do for me, they have to do for everybody. Otherwise, there would be really big trouble. So within I think maybe the next quarter, everybody was on a quarterly advance basis. And I think that's the way they still do it. So, and again, that was just a function of having worked in the Bureau and know how they operate. So it was just part of my education.
It's your education, but you also build on your networking skills and
yes.
your collaborative skills.
Yes.
This was someone you knew.
Yes.
And so having those networks, knowing what you need to do, you are able to effectively make the change.
Yes. The networking and the relationships are crucial to doing this kind of work, and especially crucial in working in the Indian community, because if your reputation in that community is not good, you're not going to get anything done. And the man that was our overseer knew me. I was the administrator for many years at the school, and I was in charge of all the contracts. So, I mean, I knew what I was doing. It's not like I didn't know. And he knew that I knew what I was doing. So, part of it was my making the threats, with the congressional investigations, but the other part of it was that he knew I knew how to do that work. So I think he trusted that.
Yes.
So I think that was part of it. Right about that same time that we were having our little struggles with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we were having some struggles with the state because the consortium had applied for a license, for a state license to become a foster family agency, and they actually were licensed, but they hadn't done the other part of it, which is apply for the rate. So even though they had the license, they didn't have a rate. So they were not getting the administrative reimbursement that you get per child, which pays for your facility and pays for your social workers. So one of the first things I did was I sat down with my staff and I said, well, why didn't you apply for the rate? And they said, well, we just didn't know how to do the formulas, and we didn't know how to do that piece of it. And I said, oh, okay. Well, I said, well, give me the paperwork. Let's figure it out. So we did. We sat down. We looked through all the forms. We figured it out, sent it in, and we got a rate. So then the state had to, give us the rate that they gave every other foster family agency, which they had never done before. So at that time, there was only a handful of homes that we had, maybe 5 or 6 on the reservations, very, very small number. And all of the payments for the foster care came through the county. So the county was actually using our homes. So at the same time that we're taking care of the rates business and taking care of the business with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we were doing recruiting because we had started to receive telephone calls from family members, from tribal councils, from any number of people saying, well, we know that our little niece or nephew or grandchild has been removed. They're in the foster care system. We don't know where they are. We know they're not in an Indian home. And so once those referrals started coming to us and we started following up, then we spent a period of time, maybe 18 to 24 months, just in the process of retrieving all those children out of the foster care system, identifying them. Really, our charge was to try and find relative placements. The Indian Child Welfare Act says, first you'll place with extended family. So our job really was to find extended family. So we started doing what is now called family finding. So we would do due diligence, thorough searches to find relatives who could take these children into care. So that was the first thing we would do. If we couldn't find an appropriate relative who was willing to take the child, then they would go into foster care. So,
And it would be your foster home.
our foster homes that we certified, that we monitored, that we took care of. So, so we started. So we had some foster homes. We started to having children in care, children in placement, and in a period of about, it wasn't long, maybe a couple of years. The county of San Diego will never admit this, but we had them 100% compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act. Not because they wanted to be, but because we had identified every single one of the tribal children that was in the caseload in San Diego, and they were either in a relative placement. We had 60% of our kids were in relative placements, and the other 40% then where we couldn't, they were out-of-state kids, so there was no immediate family nearby. Those children are the ones that would go into foster care. So we had, at one point we had like about 126 children in our caseload that were in foster care.
And was this exclusively San Diego County, or did you also service other counties?
Well, actually San Diego and Riverside.
Riverside.
And then at one point, the Indian Center in Los Angeles lost its funding, and they had this large caseload of children, and so we took it over. The state of California gave us a one-time grant of $70,000. They gave one to each of the ICWA programs in the state, and I think there were 3 of us at the time. So they gave each one $70,000. It was a one-time thing. I don't know why they did it. But they gave us this money, and so I went to my board and I said, there's this whole caseload of children that are in Orange and LA County, and there's nobody to provide services for them. So I said, the right thing to do is to take on that caseload. And I said, and it's not going to come out of our funds, but because look, the state gave us $70,000, and we can do that caseload with that amount of money. So they said, the board said, well, let's do it then. So we took on that caseload as well. And what I did was I just kept the staff that was already working those cases on with the money that we got from the state. So, but then it wasn't going to be that we're going to do this forever. It was, we're going to help them write their next grant so that they can get funded again. So that's what we did. We helped them write the grant. We helped them get funded, and then as soon as they got the money, we gave them back the caseload. So we worked the caseload for about 17 months.
It's kind of a foster agency.
It was a foster agency. So we gave them back the caseload. So for a while there, it was a large area that we were trying to cover. It was San Diego, it was Riverside, it was Orange, it was LA, and then we also had a few homes in San Bernardino. So it was
It's a huge area.
It's a huge area. Geographically, it was really, really large. And we had a couple of tribes, one from Imperial, the Kitsan from Imperial, and we had Fort Mojave, which is in San Bernardino County, who wanted to join the consortium. They had invited me out. Their tribal councils had invited me out and talked with us, and they wanted to become part of the consortium. But at that time, we did not have the resources to be able to do. San Bernardino County at that time was the largest county in the whole country. It's huge, geographically it's just unbelievable. And Imperial, I didn't have the staff. I knew we couldn't do a good job. If we had gone ahead and done it, we couldn't have done a good job. And I wasn't willing to do a mediocre job. So we had to defer. So over all this period of time, We had our little encounters with the state. They didn't, after they found out how much money they were paying us for the children that we had in care, they decided that it was too much money, and so they didn't want to pay it. So they told us that we had to apply for a non-treatment rate, which then, I'm sure you know what that means. Basically, it means you don't get any of the administrative money, and all you get is the pass-through money for the foster parents. But they expected my staff to continue to monitor the homes and do all the safety checks and, you know, make sure that the children were well and provide services to the families for nothing, for free. So I said, no, we're not doing that. And so we, you know, basically we made some threats about class action suits and that sort of thing. And so they finally, I didn't talk about that in my comments this morning. I didn't want to do anything inflammatory. Eventually they backed down, and that problem went away. So now everything's smooth sailing. The Bureau's doing nice things, the state's doing nice things, the county's acting better, the courts are being pleasant. Then the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington D.C. decides to start defunding urban programs. Biggest mistake that's ever been made was defunding urban programs. So they thought because our office was in Escondido and wasn't on one of the reservations, they thought we were an urban program. So they defunded us. So of course it was time, you know, to call in the troops. So basically I appealed it. I appealed it to our Sacramento office, to the office in Washington, D.C., the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. I let my congressional delegation know about it. I also let the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs know about it, and also Senator Ted Kennedy, who was a friend of our program. So we submitted our appeals, and shortly after we did that, I got a call from our Sacramento office saying, you know, don't close down, don't close your doors. I said I wasn't planning on it. And he said your appeal's being heard, and it looks like it's pretty good. And he had assured them, he had assured Washington D.C. that we were not an urban program, that we were a consortium of tribes. And so basically they upheld the appeal, and they gave us our money, and then they decided to give us some extra money. I think that was just, you know, trying to smooth ruffled feathers. I don't know what it was about, but they gave us some extra money. They brought our funding all the way up to as much as any program could receive. So now everybody was happy, including me.
There were many, many challenges.
Always.
That continued to arise, that
always
were obstacles to being able to provide the services the children and
Yes.
families needed.
Yes, there were always obstacles, but there were good people and good times as well. So right about that time, we'd been going along for a while, and things were looking relatively good. And then we began to discover something really interesting. Is while we were working the cases, and they were in reunification, we found that if they were in reunification and the children went back home and were reunified, that was good. That's the best disposition of a case you could ever hope for. We began to notice that when there wasn't reunification, and the cases went into adoptions, that all of a sudden we had no say in what happened. Nobody would talk to us. They wouldn't tell us, you know, what was going on. And we began to see that some of our kids were being adopted out to non-Indian homes. And that's not following the Indian Child Welfare Act anyway. And so we decided that one way to remedy that was to become a state licensed adoption agency ourselves. So I talked to our board about it and told them that, you know, this is not a good thing for our children. So they said, well, go ahead and apply for the license. And when we first got ready to apply, Community Care Licensing said, you can go ahead and apply. They said, but we're not issuing licenses. We haven't issued them for a while because there are too many adoption agencies right now. So I thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So we went ahead and submitted our application. They sent it back to us. There were a couple of places in our program statement they didn't like. They wanted us to explain this a little more and that a little more. We hadn't set a rate, because we were never intending to charge for the adoptions. We were just going to do them. But we had to set a rate. Anyway, so we did. We set a rate. We made one up, set a rate. And with the stipulation that we could waive the rate if we didn't want to charge the parents. So we waited, and then one day I got a call from the man. His name was Sergio Ramirez. He was the analyst in charge of our agency, and he said, I wanted to call you personally. He says, because your license is granted, and he said, you're the first license that we've given out in 2 years. And then he wished us well, which I thought was really, really sweet. So, so we were so happy. We had our license. Oh,
it's a remarkable achievement.
We went out and bought our certain kinds of file cabinets. They had to be metal and they had to be encased in concrete. Water, they had to be fireproof. So, and they're expensive and they're heavy as heck. So we went out and bought our file cabinets. Boy, we're going to start doing some adoptions, and we got no referrals. So I had become pretty good friends with one of the adoptions workers, and one day I got a letter from him, in which a letter he had written to his supervisor, and he had copied me, and basically it said that he was going to refuse to take any more Indian referrals, because there was an agency that was licensed to do Indian adoptions, and that we were fully qualified to do it, otherwise they wouldn't have given us the license. And not only that, but we were better prepared to take care of our own children and our own families. We would be better able to find the appropriate families for these children. So we started getting the referrals. And we started doing, happiest day of my work there was the first adoption that we did. That was the happiest day of my work life there. So we had a big party. So we started doing the adoptions, and sometime later we were invited to a conference. The Bureau used to take us to conferences because we were sort of a model program. By this time they figured out we were a model program, because we used to do the full range of services. We would do the prevention work. So part of our funding went to do prevention. So when we got a call that somebody might be in danger of having their child removed, we would go out and work with those families to help take care of the issues that were putting them in that kind of danger, and work with them. If the children finally did have to be removed, then of course we had the foster care. We did the relative search. We had foster care. So we had the full range of services. It was an interesting time.
It sounds as though it was a very satisfying time, in that so many obstacles were overcome, and you were actually working with the children and families.
Yes.
Making things happen.
Yes. And I had a really, really, really good staff. They were, everybody kept saying to me, well, Margaret, you're beating your head against a brick wall, because you're never going to find tribal people who are qualified to do this work. And I said, well, yes, I will. And all of our people, we had a few non-tribal people, usually 1 or 2 social workers, but really I had a staff of 26. And out of that, a couple were non-tribal. All the rest were tribal.
Well, in our discussion, you have mentioned several times ICWA, or the Indian Child Welfare Act. And from what I know about you, that was an area in which you had a specific passion for understanding, disseminating information about that law, and ensuring that the requirements of that law were met. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship with ICWA?
Well, the reason the program that I was talking about, Indian Child and Family Service, existed was because of the law. So the funding that the Bureau gives to tribes and organizations is to make sure that the law is implemented, by providing services, by doing advocacy, by going to court, and doing all the work that's encompassed in making sure that the children have good outcomes. So the Indian Child Welfare Act is You know, it's not a long act. It's not very long to read, but it's powerful. It's powerful. And if you look at the act itself, if you look at the letter of the law, you know, that's one thing. But if you look beyond it, if you look at the underpinnings of the law, it's talking about preserving culture.
Yes.
It's talking about keeping children within culture. So, really, that's the spirit of the law. And that's the part of it that drew me. That's the part of it that I wanted to be sure that people understood, that it doesn't matter if the child's eligible for enrollment in a tribe, it doesn't matter if they come from a non-federally recognized tribe. Good social work practice dictates that this child remains in its community and tied to family and culture, because those are resilience factors that make sure that that child's going to grow up healthy and well. So yes, there's a great passion for it, to ensure that. Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
A very, very important part of legislation related to children and child welfare. It came early on in the history of child welfare development as we know it today, and it is still with us some 30 years later.
Yes.
And as you say, ignored in some sectors.
Yes.
And what I hear you saying is that with the development of your organizations, you demanded the attention that it requires or that it needs, and held those who were in positions of management in public sector to the letter of the law.
Yes. That they had to be accountable and responsible.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's what I wanted.
Just
So
great advocacy for
yes.
children
Yes.
and families.
So, well, I was one person of many. When I first started working at the ICFS, at Indian Child and Family Services, the year that I first started working there were 11 ICWA programs funded in the state of California. The second year that I was there were 7. The next year, there were 4. So you can see that there was a large population that was not being served. So for those of us that were left, we had to be that voice. I don't think there was a choice about it. You know, if you're a person with a conscience, then you're going to do what's right. And so we made sure that everybody knew about the law. We were asked on 2 occasions to speak before the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs. The first time we went to Washington D.C. to do that. And basically it was just to talk about the fact that in this great state of California, with so many Indian people, with so many tribes, that they were not compliant. And they had no intention of being compliant. So you need to talk about that. You can't just let it be hidden. So yeah, so we went and talked about it. Absolutely. And we did it again. The Senate Select Committee came to California and went up and down the state. They had meetings with tribal people up and down the state, and they had one of their meetings in Escondido, which is where my office was based. And they invited me to speak. So again, it's just saying the same thing. There's no compliance. Nothing happens if you don't comply, because the act doesn't have any teeth in it that way. If you don't comply, well, you don't comply. But there's no punishment. It's not like if you're in a 25-mile zone and you're doing 60 and you get caught, there's going to be a fine. There's no fine. There's no hand slapping. There's no nothing. So the only way to get any kind of compliance was to make sure that people knew that people weren't being compliant. So then that's what we did.
Okay. You have been working more recently as a consultant to Indian tribes, and you are currently working as the assistant coordinator, Tribal Star Program, Academy for Professional Excellence, located at San Diego State School of Social Work.
Right. That's a lot of things to say in one sentence, isn't it? The consultant work that I did, I left ICFS mostly because I was tired. I was physically pretty exhausted, and mentally and emotionally and every other way I was tired. I was tired of fighting all the time. So so I decided to leave. I left it in a very good state. They had you know, they had good offices, they had great staff, well-trained staff, and they had a whole bunch of money in the bank. You know, part of my plan was that we would always have at least 3 months operating expenses. You know, you never knew when the Bureau was going to try and close you down again. So I thought if they have 3 months operating expenses, it gives people the chance to find another job if they're going to close you down. So I thought, you know, as a responsible administrator, I'll have that much money in the bank. We actually had more. We had like about $1 million in the bank. So when I left, I thought, you know, they're in good shape. Now I'm going to go take care of myself. So I was a consultant for tribes and Indian organizations. I was a grant writer. I was hired by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to monitor, to do an evaluation of all the ICWA programs that were funded in the state of California. At that time, there were 7 that were funded, so I got to go visit all of them. Also at that time, I was hired by tribes to go in and help them develop their own ICWA programs. So I would go in and do assessments with them and see what kind of caseloads they had and what kind of staffing they would need and how much money they would need and everything that it would take to do a program. Other programs were already running, and they hired me to do their public relations materials for them. So I would do that. I did foster parent handbooks for them. I did policy and procedures, whatever the program needed. Whatever they needed, I would go in and help them do that. So I did that for about 8 years, off and on, because in between that, I worked for some non-Indian programs. I ran foster family and adoption agencies for non-Indian programs. So that was...
And your experience was running those programs. Were the challenges different, or less demanding, or less exhausting?
Well, we didn't have all the battles when we went into court about, you know, ICWA that nobody wanted to follow. This was just regular. Whatever happens for everybody else happens for these children. There were still battles. I mean, nothing's good about having to put children in foster care. Nothing's good about that. But the work was very different. It was very different. And it was hard. Anytime you're working with children and families in crisis, it's hard. But for me, it was different, and I really enjoyed that. And I met, you know, really wonderful people who are, some of them were today at the gathering, that have stayed friends over the many years. That, you know, we still see each other, we still visit with each other, and so it was a good time for me. It was a good time.
Well, what about your current position?
Well, let's see. How did that happen? 2003. I started getting email and telephone calls from friends of mine, some of whom were in the room today, saying, Margaret, there's this position that's been posted at the Academy for Professional Excellence website, and it looks like somebody sat down and asked you questions and then they wrote it for you. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And they said, well, get on their website and look at it. So I did. I opened it up, looked at it, and I thought, oh yeah, this might be fun. And so I went ahead and made an application. And actually the young woman who ran the program then took the applications, and then she turned around and called the tribal partners who were already on board, and gave they gave my name and they gave Tom's name, my friend Tom, that we had applied for the positions, and what did they think? And they said, well, yes to both of them. So we were hired, and yes, I applied for the position of assistant coordinator. There were some things that were very attractive about that position. The first thing was it was part-time. The second thing was I didn't have to supervise anybody. And the third thing was, although they didn't know it, I was going to get to do all the PR materials, just develop materials, which is what I wanted to do. So it was a perfect fit for me. So I was very happy to be hired. And then we actually started doing the work, and over the course of the first 5 years, the young woman who was the program manager was very young and had just started her family, and she was just about to have her third child. She had she had two of them while we were working. She would go off on maternity leave and such, and so she decided she wanted to stay home and take care of her children. And I thought it was a good, wise move on her part because they were all so young. So she left, and then they made me the interim director, again, asking me if I would take it on as the director, and I said no. I like doing what I'm doing. And then the staff there, my team, prevailed on me to take the position as the manager, and they said, come on, do it. We'll be okay. So I did. I did take it, and so we've been doing that since 2008.
And what kind of services does the organization provide today?
Our program was specifically designed to provide curricula and training for social workers who were working with tribal youth who were emancipating from the foster care system. Mm-hmm. So it was aimed at primarily independent living skills staff, so that these children would be prepared to leave foster care and to be successful. So that's how we started out. It was to do that kind of training, which we did. We developed the curricula and we did the training. But what we discovered in the course of doing the training, that the real need was to develop a collaborative of the tribes, the counties, and the agencies, the private and public agencies that serve the children, bring them all together and begin to look at some of the gaps in services and begin to find ways to begin to fill the gaps. So that really is what began to happen as we started increasing our partnerships. So we went from 4 partners to 15 partners, and we still have people that are waiting to join. So it's turned into a really good collaborative relationship. We get all of the people at the table. We have a vision about how we want to operate, and young people are just getting better services. After the grant was over, after the 5 years, we expanded our services. So now we were not just doing the rural children, we were doing all the children. And we were not doing just youth who were emancipating, but all children who were in the foster care system who were tribal. So actually it increased our scope of work. Mm-hmm. So, and as a result of the work we were doing in Southern California, we were invited to participate in the Breakthrough Collaborative Series that was sponsored by the State of California Department of Social Services and the Casey Family Programs. And they were focusing on what can we do to impact the disproportionate number of tribal children that are in the foster care system. So, and out of that came the American Indian Enhancement Project, which developed tools. It was a toolkit. So tools, curricula, that's housed on the CalSWEC site. So anybody who wants to work with implementing ICWA and getting compliance in the county can download the toolkit. They can ask for technical assistance, and they can work on improving their ICWA compliance. So that was an outgrowth of the work that we do in Southern California. And then as a result of that, we also got invited to become part of the National Resource Center for Tribes, which is a national program. And so actually I knew the young lady who's now one of the co-directors, and I actually worked together at ICFS for many years. And we've always been in touch. So she asked me to be on their advisory board, and Tom and I are also senior consultants. So we go out to different states and work with tribes and states, trying again to achieve compliance with ICWA. So it's a lot of fun.
I'm hearing kind of we're back with that same population that you started with many years ago.
Yes.
And all of the experiences in between
yes.
have been utilized and built upon. It's just a remarkable career that you're describing, but not just a career. It's a change and an impact on a whole population of people that have been touched by the work that you are doing.
Well, the work that we are doing.
Yes.
That we are doing.
You, I use as a plural.
Yes.
The
Yes,
you
yes.
and your colleagues,
Right.
and that network that has been created around your vision
Yes.
and the vision of ICWA.
Yes.
What were the positive experiences that you drew from this? It was a struggle much of the time, but what were the positives?
There were many positives. I mean, yes, we were always struggling and fighting, but you know, I wasn't doing it by myself. I had this wonderful staff. I had a wonderful support system in my family, and I had this network of people who were doing like work, not only here in the state of California, but throughout the country. So those relationships really supported the work. So I never felt like I was alone in it. I always knew that, you know, I could count on my family. As part of the work, when I was working at Indian Child, I became a foster parent because I wanted to know what that felt like. So I decided to become certified, and I took children into care. Primarily, this when they were taking away the children that were exposed to drugs in utero. So almost all the babies I got were in withdrawals of some kind. And so my family helped me out with that, helped me take care of the children. I always had that support. There were the triumphs. And any time that you win a battle, you have to celebrate that, you know. And you know that it was never going to go back to being how it used to be. That forever that was going to be changed in some way, hopefully for the positive, and hopefully a step forward and not 2 steps back. So that was the payoff for doing the work. The other thing was getting to see the children. They would come by the office with the children when they were first going to be placed, and I would see the children as they were when they were picked up, and then when the foster parents would bring them in 2 or 3 weeks or a month, sometimes I didn't even recognize the children because they had changed so much, and that they were happy and they were being well cared for. That was the payoff. When we started doing the adoptions, and knowing that the kids were going into adoptive homes either with their relatives or with somebody on the reservation that knew them and that knew the family, that we knew those kids were going to know their extended family. I mean, that's the best thing you could hope for the children. So there were a lot of good things about it. A lot of good things.
How are we doing today?
You shouldn't have asked me that question. What I'm going to say is there are still many problems and issues. The Indian Child Welfare Act is still not being implemented. There's still not compliance. We still have Indian children that are going into non-Indian foster care, that are being adopted out to non-Indian homes. You know, nobody hates non-Indian people, but these children need to stay within culture. It's a source of strength for them. It's a source of that sense of belonging they're not going to get anywhere else. If we don't let the kids stay connected to their culture and in their communities, they're lost. And so those are the kids that you hear about, you know, the ones that are alcoholic or abusing drugs or any of the million other things that happen. You know, so we don't need that anymore. This law has been in existence for almost 34 years now. I think that's plenty of time for us to get it, that we need to be doing the right thing. So I'll say we have some work to do on that. So I think we just need to keep fighting the good fight and, you know, taking our little battles where we can take them and keep going forward until the whole country is 100% ICWA compliant.
I was going to ask you for words of wisdom for young people making decisions about a career, but it seems to me you may have just already given us some words of wisdom. Any additional thoughts for young people who are going to be working with this population? What if they are non-Indian? Can non-Indians effectively work with this population?
Well, one of the reasons I had asked my friend Kathy Bridgeland that was sitting at the table with me, she's non-Indian, and she was an ICWA director for as many years as I was. She ran a fabulous program They had one of the best models for working with urban families than any I have ever seen. She had a passion for it. She had the utmost respect from the tribal community in Los Angeles. Everybody knew who she was. Everybody always spoke of her so highly. And she was a tremendous friend to me in those times when it got difficult. She was, you know, a person I knew I could pick up the phone, didn't matter, day, night, weekend, didn't matter what it was. She would listen, and she always did the right thing, you know, with our tribal community. So I say there are certain people who can work in the community and who can gain the respect of the community and who can make inroads into that community, but it takes very special people to do that. I'll say that.
Are there any other comments that you'd like to share in closing?
Well, for the young people, especially our young tribal people, there is an American Indian recruitment project right now, and we're recruiting young people to go into social work, and we already have a couple of them. It's a brand new little project that just started, and we already have a couple of young people that are going to be going into master's programs, MSWs. So we're still on a campaign. We're on a campaign to get our own young tribal people to graduate from, you know, with their masters of social work. We want them to go back and work in their tribal ICWA programs. We also want them to work for counties and states. We want them to learn how they work, to get into policy-making positions so that they can make even greater changes. So my hope is, you know, we always encourage those young people. We mentor some of them and try to, you know, support them and teach them and encourage them to go back and work for their community. So, and we pray for them all the time.
Margaret, I thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing your insights and your experiences with us. They are inspiring, and they certainly document how tenacity and persistence and knowledge and networking can affect change over the long haul.
Yes.
So,
Well, thank you for having invited me.
thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.